Welcome, everyone. I'm Nat Nasworth with the American Values Coalition. If this is the first time joining us, if you've never been to an American Values Coalition event before, our mission is growing a community of Americans empowered to lead with truth, reject extremism and misinformation, and defend democracy. We have lots of different resources on our website and our YouTube page. You can go there to watch all of our previous webinars, and you can sign up for our newsletter at americanvalues.org. Tonight, our webinar is on Christian nationalism. How dangerous is it really? And our guest is Professor Mark David Hall. He's professor of political science at Robertson School of Government at Regent University. And his most recent book is Who's Afraid of Christian Nationalism? Why Christian Nationalism is Not an Existential Threat to America or the Church. We also have another speaker who will hopefully make it be logging on soon. And there he is, actually. It's Paul Miller. He's professor of the practice of international affairs at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. And he's also the author of The Religion of American Greatness, What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism? And then my co-host tonight is Pastor Caleb Campbell, pastor of Desert Springs Bible Church. And he also has a book on Christian nationalism, not yet published, coming out July 2nd, Disarming Leviathan, Loving Your Christian Nationalist Neighbor. And again, the topic tonight is Christian nationalism. How dangerous is it really? So just so you know, that nobody here is taking the pro-Christian nationalism position. Not that we would be opposed to hosting a debate on the merits of Christian nationalism, but that is not the topic of the debate tonight. It's everyone here is opposed to Christian nationalism. The issue is how dangerous is it? So we're going to we'll have Mark Hall will speak for 15 minutes on this question, and then we'll have Paul Miller speak for 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for the Q&A. You'll be able to ask questions in the you'll be able to ask questions. Just put your questions in the Q&A part. Don't put it in the chat. Notice there's two buttons down there. Make sure you're putting your questions in the Q&A part. And then also make sure your question is on topic, please. So I know everyone's here coming, with your own thoughts and ideas and everything, but please make sure your questions are responding to what you're hearing in the webinar. That would be most helpful to us. And you'll also be able to upvote questions that you like. And we'll try to get to the most liked questions first. And please keep your questions brief. It's very difficult if it's a very long-winded question that Caleb will have to read in order to get to try to figure out what the question is. So please keep those questions brief. And so kicking it off for us tonight, Mark Hall.
Well, thank you very much, Nap and Caleb. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really value the work you all do with the American Values Coalition. So just by way of context, I'm mostly a scholar of the American founding and religious liberty and church-state relations in America. Almost all my work has been on those subjects. But I'll begin by explaining how I got interested in Christian nationalism and discuss some of my problems with the inflated threats that most of the literature on the topic makes. And then I'll get down eventually to what I think Christian nationalism actually is. And I agree that it's problematic and that we as Christians should be the first to confront it. So on January 6, 2021, I was flying home from a speaking engagement. And when I landed in Dallas, I checked my email and I had a note from a reporter who said, "Can you comment on the Christian images among the Capitol Hill rioters?" And this is the first I had heard of the riot, and I was shocked. And I said, "Well, certainly, send me some images." It took her about 20 minutes to get them to me. So as I was waiting, scrolled through the video, and you could see lots of video, scroll through it quickly and this sort of thing. And what I saw was a sea of Trump hats, a sea of MAGA hats, a sea of American flags, and no Christian symbols. So my curiosity was perked. Eventually, the reporter sent me some images that were grabbed from various Twitter posts. Several of them were around the Washington Monument, which is 1.5 miles from the U.S. Capitol. And they involved a woman who had a sign that said something like God, freedom, and country, something like that. Again, there was a large wooden cross. There was a large rally for Trump that day, and a lot of people were there, and they were praying and blowing horns and this sort of thing. But I think it's important to distinguish between people at that rally and people who attacked Capitol Hill. I actually know some people who were there, went to the rally, went home, had no idea there was a riot that day. Well, eventually, a few images came through that were, in fact, from among the Capitol Hill rioters. One was a Pine State flag. This is a Revolutionary era flag, so you could imagine someone might bring it for that reason. They consider themselves to be participating in the Second American Revolution or something like that. The flag has the words "an appeal to heaven" on them. These words could be from judges, but they could also be from John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. The only real obvious, clear Christian symbol among the actual rioters that was sent to me was a crazy-looking goth guy holding a Bible. And so I cautioned the reporter. I said, you might want to be careful with this narrative you seem to be crafting. She completely ignored me and came out with the story the next day: Christian nationalists have attacked the U.S. Capitol building. And she quoted scholars like Samuel Perry. The attack is as Christian nationalist as you get. And stories like this were placed in papers throughout the nation. And so this really perked my curiosity. And so I dove, I'm an academic, so I dove into the literature on Christian nationalism. What you find, if you look at it historically, literally almost no one is talking about Christian nationalism before 2006. Beginning in 2006, a number of polemical authors would issue about one book every 2 years. So Julia Engelhardt, Michelle Goldberg, Catherine Stewart, Andrew Seidel, Chris Hedges, and others. One thing I know, Paul and I probably agree on many things, but we agree that this is ridiculous literature. It's just polemical literature using rhetoric and guessing at things to paint this threat. It really is a toxic threat of Christians who want to take over America and oppress everyone except for white Christian males. And so this was just so ridiculous, I was prompted to write a response to it. Eventually, scholars got involved, people like Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, Taking America Back for God. And these are responsible social scientists, but they too painted a picture, an absolute toxic stew of Christian theocrats who are racist, sexist, militarist, homophobic. And they calculate that 51.9% of Americans fully or partially embrace this toxic stew. Now, not being a number crunching political scientist, I could still look at this and say these measures are wildly off. They really have to do with things such as whether or not you support a high wall of separation between church and state or not, whether prayer should be allowed in public schools is one of the statements they use. And so it just struck me as completely not measuring what they purport to measure. And so even the relatively academic critics, I think, are producing some pretty poor literature on the subject. And so this inspired me to write a couple of white papers and start publishing a variety of online pieces here or there, being critical of some of this literature and offering my own analysis of it. Now, I'm a Christian, and I got to tell you, sometimes Christians are imprudent. So between 2006 and 2022, almost literally, no one is identifying himself or herself as a Christian nationalist. And it's only used as a negative, as a slur, really. And so, of course, in 2022, Marjorie Taylor Greene comes out and says, hey, I'm a Christian nationalist. And, this is incredibly imprudent, I think, to label herself this with, self-label herself with something that almost all Americans have a negative opinion of, if they've heard of it at all. Pew shows that about 55% of Americans haven't heard of the phrase Christian nationalist. Of those who've have 25% have a negative view of it. 5%, only 5% have a positive view of it. So why you would call yourself a Christian nationalist is beyond me. And then in that same year, of course, Al Mohler, Doug Wilson came out and they said, we aren't going to run from the label Christian nationalism. And then you had Stephen Wolfe and Torben Nisker publishing books, Torben Nisker really a pamphlet advocating for it. Well, of course, I had to read all this stuff, and I find it just completely wrong. So the critics are wrong in inflating the threat and claiming to measure something they don't measure. And the the actual handful of people who are advocating for Christian nationalism, I think, are just profoundly wrong for prudential, for constitutional, for biblical, and for theological reasons. And so I felt compelled to respond to all this and try to set the record straight, giving reasons why Christians must reject the toxic stew that Whitehead and Perry called Christian nationalism. Of course, we should have nothing to do with that sort of thing, but we should also reject what the actual advocates are calling for, the creation of a Christian society, in Stephen Wolfe's case with a Christian prince who's going to call church synods and judge their efficacy and punish lazy ministers and this sort of thing. Just really a set of horrible ideas. I think he's a very decent person. We've interacted before. I saw he and Paul Miller debate, and they had a very civil debate, but I think his ideas are profoundly wrong. So eventually I get to the point where I define what I think Christian nationalism is. And this is something I understand a number of our watchers might be pastors. And this is something I'm sure that you've seen and that you're wondering how you deal with it. So I define Christian nationalism as a view that America was founded as a Christian nation, and that today, in 2024, local, state, and federal government should favor Christianity above all other religions. Now, most Christian nationalists, I think, generally think that non-Christians should be tolerated, but it's perfectly fine to favor Christianity. How should Christianity be favored? Well, for instance, Congress could declare the United States to be a Christian nation. Or we could have teachers and coaches lead school children in public schools in distinctively Christian prayers. And there's some other measures out there about the US Constitution being divinely inspired. So when you look at all those, what you see is about 20% of Americans really do want to favor Christianity, want the state to favor Christianity above all other religions. And what I do, I spend then 2 chapters in the book, Who's Afraid of Christian Nationalism, explaining why I think this is wrong. First of all, it's incredibly not imprudential in a country where only about 64% of Americans even identify as Christians. And of course, a huge percentage of those don't bother to pray or read their Bible or go to church. So basically, practicing Christians are a minority, and it would just be disruptive and counterproductive, I think, to try to get Congress to declare America to be a Christian country or to do it at the state level or the local level. As well, constitutionally, as I argue in my book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? America's founders were profoundly influenced by Christianity, but in the constitutional order they created, they insisted on religious equality. They insisted that all Americans have the right to worship God according to dictates of conscience. Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and others of Americans of European descent. Basically, everyone's a Christian except for 1,500 Jews or so. But George Washington, in his letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, made it crystal clear that Jews enjoy the benefits of religious liberty on the same terms as everyone else. We have the U.S. Constitution that, of course, bans religious tests for federal office. And very nicely in Article 2 and elsewhere contains an accommodation that would allow Quakers and other religious minorities who have objections to swearing oaths to decline to do so, to affirm them instead. So constitutionally, Christian nationalism is a bad idea. I also make biblical arguments that Christianity shouldn't be favored above other faiths. A simple one, I give a number of them, but I would say the golden rule, right? Just think about it for a minute. I don't want to send my children to schools where they're led in Islamic prayers. And so I should understand that Islamic parents don't want to send their children to schools where they are led in Christian prayers. Now, one thing I do insist on is the U.S. Supreme Court since 1981 has said public schools must allow prayer. So you can pray over your math test, you can pray over your lunch, an Islamic student can pray at the appropriate times of the day, even in a public school. I would suggest it's profoundly illiberal to prohibit prayer in public schools. And incidentally, if I mention it briefly, I'll mention it again. One of the measures that Whitehead and Perry use is your response to the statement, should prayer be allowed in public school? If you just agreed with what I said, if you strongly agreed, that gets you well on your way to being a Christian nationalist as they define the term. And yet I would suggest that even as people who are ranking high on their measures are reasonably called Christian nationalists, in some respects, it doesn't necessarily make you a racist, a sexist, a homophobic, a militarist, or this sort of thing. And even Whitehead and Perry, let me just mention, they let their implicit biases show. they clearly state twice that if you are pro-life, you are primarily concerned with controlling women's bodies, and so therefore you're a sexist. If you believe that religious liberty means something more than the freedom of worship, you're a bigot. And what they have in mind, of course, is a Jack Phillips. But the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution protects the free exercise of religion. It has always protected something more than the freedom to worship. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And the liberal justice William Brennan in 1963 developed a wonderful test for interpreting the free exercise clause that again makes it crystal clear that religious liberty in America protects more than the freedom to worship. All right, so I conclude the book then by explaining how I think Christians should engage in political activity. We should do so seeking the flourishing of all humans. We should treat everyone with respect and dignity, since we're all created in the imago Dei. We should be honest, we should be winsome, and this sort of thing. So hopefully this makes a contribution. I suppose those of you who are pastors, I would suggest the sort of resources you need to look at are the sort of books written by Paul Miller and myself, because we're insiders. We're both conservative Christians. We love the church, and yet we reject all variations of Christian nationalism, and hopefully you can get some good ideas about how to argue with your parishioners and others as to why this is a bad idea. It's not a bad idea because these ex-evangelicals who are so prone to write these works are screaming that the sky is falling. It's a bad idea for prudential, constitutional, theological, and biblical reasons, and those sorts of reasons, I hope, will convince your fellow Christians to reject Christian nationalism in all of its forms.
Thank you, Mark. Paul?
Thank you. Thank you, Knapp and Caleb, for inviting me and Mark to come and talk about this important subject. And Mark, good to see you again, and always happy to have this conversation again. We've had it in a couple of different places. I don't know if I have the ability to share my screen. Nope, I can't. Mark started off by reference to January 6th, so I was going to respond similarly by showing a clip from January 6th that shows some Christian nationalist rhetoric.
You can try it now.
I can try it now. Let's see if this will work. Try this. So if you can see, I'm showing a YouTube clip, and hopefully the audio will work. And we're just going to listen to the prayer they prayed on the floor of the U.S. Senate.
Well, we don't have the audio, but we are able to read the subtitles.
I'll stop it right there. You heard them very clearly say, Jesus Christ, we invoke your name. And they thanked God for allowing them, the rioters, to show that this is our nation, not theirs, the communist, globalists, and tyrants. It's a very clear, it captures well what I think Christian nationalism is. It's one version or one expression. There's lots of varieties, and there's a spectrum of Christian nationalism. Right there at the Capitol attack, you heard them invoke Jesus's name to lay claim to America, that somehow we Christians have a special prerogative, a right, a title. They have a proprietary claim to define what America is and who belongs as an American. So I'd submit that as an example of Christian nationalism that I believe was definitely present alongside many other things on January 6th. Our discussion is primarily about how dangerous is Christian nationalism? Who's afraid of Christian nationalism? And this is where I think Mark and I will differ. I'm not going to dispute the numbers, the statistics. What I will say is a social phenomenon like Christian nationalism, there's a lot of varieties to it. Some are more alarming, some are less. I'd actually offer a typology that kind of helps us wrap our minds around this broad phenomenon. But then I want to explain why I'm still alarmed by it, even as I recognize the broad varieties, some of which are less harmful or less dangerous. So to kind of sketch out this typology, I'd say there's two things that differentiate the kinds of Christian nationalism. One is, are we talking about the kind of elite, scholarly, top-down, academic Christian nationalism, or are we talking about the more popular practice, the bottom-up praxis of Christian nationalism as practiced in the pews and the streets? That's one axis of differentiation. The other one is on, I'd say, are we talking about the moderate kind that is more popular and more mainstream, or are we talking about the kind that is, I would say, more extreme and dangerous and even sometimes violent, I think, as we saw on January 6th? Right, so if you take those two, you get a nice little 2x2 matrix. All academics love these things, right? And so the elite, popular kind, I'd say that would be something like Rich Lowry's book, The Case for Nationalism, would be a good example of a elite level, top-down, but kind of broadly popular mainstream. The elite, more extreme kind would be Stephen Wolfe's book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, where he has prescriptions that are different than Rich Lowry's, and he's more strident in what he argues for. At the sort of popular level, the mainstream kind of Christian nationalism is when somebody in your church, maybe on Memorial Day, they arrange a star-spangled cross with Psalm 33:12. It says, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord." And they put that in the church on Memorial Day. The symbolism clearly indicating America and Christianity go together on this sacred holiday, right? That's popular, it's mainstream, it's a widespread kind of thing. And then the popular bottom-up, more extreme version is, I think, January 6th, right, where you see a more dangerous kind of movement. So that's kind of four types of Christian nationalism. And you might be thinking, well, there's the safe mainstream kind, like Rich Lowry and like your friend at church who has a picture of the Star-Spangled Cross. What's wrong with that? And what I would like to suggest is that that's the enabling condition, the permission structure in which the more dangerous forms of Christian nationalism take root and grow. That's kind of how social movements often operate. I'd like to offer an analogy to Ireland. In Ireland, you had a political party called Sinn Féin, and you had a terrorist group called the Irish Republican Army. And these two were out for the same thing. They both had a shared vision of Irish unity. But the Sinn Féin, the political party, pursued it through the political process and was ostensibly mainstream and peaceful. They ran for seats in parliament. They had people who gave speeches in public. The terrorist group assassinated people and set off bombs. These two groups effectively worked together, even if they were careful not to have formal linkages so that the politicians could always say, "I'm not an extremist. I'm not bombing or killing anybody." They actually benefited from the threat of violence that the IRA offered. And so there was it was very deceitful on the part of Sinn Féin to claim not to be the extremists while actually benefiting from the threat of violence always on offer by the IRA, right? That's an example I like to give. I think today we might see a similar dynamic emerging among the different kinds of Christian nationalism, where I acknowledge many people who either fit the label or accept the label, they're not out there storming the Capitol on January 6th. But there is an extremist kind of Christian nationalism out there, and I'm worried that it is a Damocles sword over American politics, that the violent or extremist kinds of Christian nationalists are threatening to exercise a heckler's veto. You know, if you don't give the peaceful Christian nationalists their way, watch out what we might do. And that's a very illiberal, unjust form of politics. And I think that the mainstream Christian nationalists have not come to grips with the extremists in their midst. I don't think that they've done enough to call them out, to denounce them, or to root out the seeds of extremism there. And part of the reason is that I think all Christian nationalism is, at its root, illiberal. I think it has the seeds within it of being a movement that is in tension, at least, with the US Constitution and with the ideals of the Declaration. And so it's very hard for the Christian nationalist, I think, to actually root out the extremists because it comes too close to home. They come too close to condemning something that is awfully close to their own worldview. The extremists and the moderates alike, they are aiming at a similar broad goal. And so it can be very difficult for the Christian nationalists to police their own ranks. That's why I'm concerned about Christian nationalism, even though the vast majority of people who might fit the category aren't out there rioting at the Capitol. It is the permission structure. It is the kind of thing that can allow more of this extremism and violence to grow. And so I remain deeply concerned about this movement. Even the mainstream, by the way, I think is constitutionally and theologically wrong. This might be the place to end my remarks. A greater danger of Christian nationalism, a greater danger than rioting at the Capitol, is the theological danger of the unhealthy mix of church and state that all forms of Christian nationalism represent. Because all forms imply a very tight connection between our religion and our earthly identities. And this is where I think Mark and I agree, is that it's unhelpful, it's unhealthy, it's theologically wrong, and it teaches the wrong things about our citizenship. And when we allow Caesar to take a role in directing public worship or public prayers, you never know what kind of gospel he's going to preach. So that's the greatest danger of Christian nationalism. And for that and the other reasons, I remain quite worried about it.
Thanks, Paul. So Caleb's going to start moderating the discussion while he's getting geared up, reading the questions. Did you want to respond to anything you heard, Mark?
Yeah, let me be crystal clear that the attack on the Capitol has to be absolutely repudiated. I do think it's problematic to characterize it as being somehow emblematic of Christian nationalism. Yes, there was a prayer. Yes, there was one Christian flag. There were a few other Christian symbols. Georgetown, working with the Smithsonian, cataloged all the symbols, and there are a ton of them. Many are the extreme far-right Aryan nation type, and I have a little section in my book on these groups. So there are racists out there. There are horrific racists who want to use violence to make sure the white race is on top. But these are tiny fraction, 1% of Americans, and they tend to not like Christianity because they understand that Christianity teaches the equality of all humans, that all humans should be treated with respect and dignity. So I'm perfectly happy to concede that there were maybe a few people among the Capitol Hill rioters motivated by something like Christian nationalism, but I don't think there's any evidence that it is, to quote Samuel Perry, as Christian nationalist as it gets. I think Christian nationalists really want to return to America to the 1950s, minus the racism, minus Jim Crow legislation, minus the sexism. They like it when In God We Trust is put on our money, when Under God is added to the pledge, where there's the prayers and in public schools. That's the sort of thing they want. And, maybe that tends a little bit in a liberal direction, but I think it's hardly a repudiation of the principles articulated so well in the Declaration of Independence upon which America is based.
Yeah, Paul, Mark, thank you both so much. And y'all just please be sure to use the Q&A function. I believe it's at the bottom of your Zoom screen, but you might have it set up differently than I do. That just helps me follow through. So one of the questions comes in from Boaz. He's asking, is there another time in history that hysteria like this has happened? And how did the church respond?
I think it's definitely there have been throughout much of American history, Christianity has been favored above other religions, to be sure, and even specific denominations. So we have established churches in 9 of the 13 colonies. The last one is disestablished in 1833. But even so, states continued to favor Christianity above other faiths in a variety of ways. North Carolina Constitution still has a religious test for office in it. Now, that's been unenforceable since 1961, but it's still there. So this is broadly Christian nationalism, kind of what I'm describing as Christian nationalism. And let me make it crystal clear that I'm glad we've moved away from that favoring of Christianity for constitutional and other reasons. In terms of the hysteria, there's definitely been times of great political turmoil. The election of 1800 was just about as bad as it gets. The 1860 and leading up to the Civil War was obviously far worse than anything we have today. I think it's fair to say. So there have been times that have been politically fraught. I worry about our polarization of politics, and this is one of my concerns with the critics of Christian nationalism. They literally call Christian nationalists fascists and Nazis, and they paint a picture of thoroughly illiberal people who truly want to oppress everyone except for white Christian males. And I just think that's inaccurate. And that sort of rhetoric doesn't help our political polarization.
I see in the questions, somebody's asked us to comment on the movie God and Country. This might actually be a good place for us to do that. I'm aware of the film God and Country. Have not actually watched it. I don't think I intend to. I'm aware of the, well, look, it's a movie criticizing Christian nationalism, and they didn't invite either me or Mark to comment on it. It seemed clear to me that they deliberately went out to find the harshest critics, the most polemical ones. It was mostly based on, I believe, Kristen Stewart's book, Power Worshippers, which I don't think is a very good book about Christian nationalism. I think Mark and I agree on that one. What those critics do is they cherry pick to create the most alarming, most damning, most critical picture possible. And it's very alarmist, and it's, I think, over the top. So I expect the movie's probably the same, but I haven't watched it. That would be my preemptive comment on that film.
So I did watch it. I reviewed it for Commonwealth. So if you just Google my name, Mark David Hall, Commonwealth, God and Country, it should come up. Yeah, it's a horrific movie. One of the reasons it's horrific, they did interview the usual suspects, Andrew Seidel, Vice President of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, Bob Boston of the same organization, Catherine Stewart. Yeah, they go to all the usual talking heads. They have two reasonable people, David French and Russell Moore, and I think they're voices of sanity in an otherwise insane film. But what they can also do is they can go to Christian churches and meetings. Greg Locke down in, what is it, Tennessee, who's just saying some horrific, scary things. And they have images of Christians saying how we have to seize America for Christ. So this stuff is out there, and this is maybe, leaning more in the dangerous direction of a dangerous version of Christian nationalism. Then I agree with Paul is out there. I think that's a tiny fraction of American Christians, though, but it is there, and the documentarians are able to capture it, and then they put it together in a package that really is clearly intended to scare people. They want to communicate the idea that Christian.
Oh, Mark, we lost you.
Can you still hear me?
Yep, Paul, I
Yeah.
got you.
All right. Well, we both gave our, we both gave our bit about the movie, so we can move on to the next question.
Yeah, great. So another question is, hey, Mark, are you back?
Am I back?
Yeah, you froze there, right? Kind of midstream. We got you.
Okay.
Yeah, so we were just finishing up kind of our thoughts about the movie. And maybe we'll push just one quick question. Are y'all familiar with the writings of R.J. Rushdoony? And maybe what are your thoughts, just real briefly, about that?
By reputation, I believe he's a dominionist or reconstructionist. I think that's an example of Christian nationalism pretty far out there. I think actually most Christian nationalists have not read Rushdoony, probably wouldn't even agree with him. He's actually, I think, an out-and-out theocrat, which I think most Christian nationalists wouldn't quite fall in that category. So I reject his teachings. I think they're wrong. They're unbiblical. The case against theocracy is pretty clear in Scripture. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. Give it to Caesar what is Caesar's," et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't spend a whole lot of time refuting it because I think most of us agree and understand that.
One of the favorite sections in my book, in my chapter on the polemical literature, I address 3 claims that the polemicists regularly make: Catherine Stewart, Julie Ingersoll, Michelle Goldberg. They all say that Rousas Rushdoony is a founder of modern Christian nationalism, that he had tremendous influence, and therefore we should be really, really afraid. And what he does is he believes the Old Testament civil law should still be normative today, and it will become normative as we become a more and more godly society. And so therefore he lays out some of the penalties under this law. Adulterers will be put to death. Men who engage in homosexual activity will be put to death, not women, interestingly enough. He's clearly into male headship, and he says some things about race that make it reasonable to claim that he's a racist. So what I suggest is all the critics, the polemical critics, not people like Paul Miller, the polemical critics want to hold him up and say, look, Rousas Rushdoony equals Pat Robertson, equals Jerry Falwell, equals David Barton. And one of the things I do is I just demolish these claims. I show that there's no reason to believe that Rousas Rushdoony had any influence other than on a tiny handful of idiosyncratic Calvinists. And I'm pretty sympathetic to Calvinist theology, but I mean, these really are idiosyncratic Calvinists that your average run-of-the-mill Calvinist would not recognize.
Agree. I think that, would it be fair to say that Stephen Wolf's work is much closer to Rushdoony than the other Christian nationalists we've talked about?
It would be, but there's significant differences. Rushdoony's a post-millennialist, Wolf is an amillennialist, and Wolf specifically criticizes the theonomists that arose in the 1960s and 70s.
Yeah.
So he at least would want to disassociate himself from Rushdoony, claims not to have been influenced by Rushdoony. But in terms of what their Christian societies would look like, there definitely is overlap, absolutely.
I think that's about right. They come to a lot of the same conclusions from different routes, yeah.
Next question comes from John. Can you point to research that shows people want to return to the 50s minus racism, sexism, etc.? My experience is the opposite. I see and hear a nostalgia about that time period, and they see changes like that as part of the problem.
Well, what I have in mind is, I think especially conservative Christians might have this view in the 1950s, where there aren't drag queen story hours in the public libraries, where kids can go to school and they aren't hit with critical race theory, where you still have prayer and Bible reading in school. And I think the polling data shows this. About 28% of Americans want to they say return. That's not really the right word, but they want to return Christian prayer to the public schools. The reason I say it's not really the right word is if you look at the prayers that were being said, say in the 1960s, they're very generic. They aren't distinctively Christian at all. They're prayers that any monotheist could nod along with. And so I don't think they're particularly honoring to the Christian God. And I think they were a waste of time largely. But this is what I mean when I say I think the Christian nationalists long to go back to an era like that. Of course, they want to keep their cell phones and advances in medicine. So not literally, but culturally, that's what they think they desire.
Yeah, they want to reestablish a generic Christianity as the framework of public philosophy and public morals in America. And when I describe it that way, a lot of people might say, "What's wrong with that?" And well, that's the rest of our conversation, right? It can have illiberal tendencies, and whose version of Christianity, who gets to say, it compromises the church's independence, it waters down a theological message, on and on and on.
Let me just say to that, Paul, and I think we're on the same boat here. Your objection involves a government promoting that sort of Christianity. I assume both you and I would pray that every American who doesn't know Christ would come to saving faith in Jesus Christ, and that all Christians start living according to biblical morality, and this would be a very good thing. The key difference maybe is that neither of us want the government involved in seeking those sorts of ends.
Yeah, somebody in the chat box asked for what is the definition of Christian nationalism? And I often give the kind of a simplistic answer. If you think America is a Christian nation and the government should keep it that way, that's Christian nationalism.
That's great. Yeah. One quick question, Paul. This is for you. Can you define Augustinian liberalism?
Yeah, so this is something I've written about in a few places and talked about before. So I think democracy is pretty great. I think democracy is the best It's the worst form of government except for all the others, right? Which means it is actually the best form of government. But the way we are sometimes trained to think about democracy by our high school civics class is more Enlightenment, more John Locke than I'm comfortable with. It's a more optimistic, almost naive, kind of utopian, if we just apply reason, everything will be fine. I think there's a different route to democracy, which is through an Augustinian appreciation of human sin. I'm a sinner, you're a sinner, you're a sinner, everybody's a sinner. And so I don't trust anybody to run our government. That means I want to diffuse power. I want checks and balances. I don't want a single tyrant making decisions. I want to let everybody to come together and vote to figure stuff out. That's, I think, an Augustinian route to justifying our democracy of liberalism, classical liberalism. And that's the kind of public philosophy I fully support. And I think the founders were Augustinian liberals. They actually read much less John Locke than you probably learned in your civics class, right? They read more Montesquieu, and they were a lot of them more Calvinists. And so they derived the necessity of checks and balances from human sin. Remember what Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers: if men were angels, we wouldn't need any government. Ambition must be made to check ambition. They were very pessimistic about human nature, and that's why we need democracy.
One of the questions comes from Susan. She says, I'm not a pastor, but do not understand why more pastors have not stepped up to speak on the truth of the gospel. I think that means in contrast to Christian nationalist view. Do any of you have insights to this reluctance or perhaps fear?
Tim Alberta has a really good journalistic account of what's going on in the churches nowadays. And I think the reality is a lot of the pastors are just afraid that if they stand up in the pulpit and preach against Christian nationalism, that 10% of the congregation or more is going to walk out the door and go to another church that praises that sort of thing. So I think there's probably some fear involved. And I don't mean that critically. That's just what I took away from his very good book.
I agree. I'd add and say that this is not a problem in the African-American church. The African-American church has always had a stronger presence in public life in the African-American community, civil rights movement. The white evangelical churches, there's a couple different political traditions. One is quietism, in which the church never says anything at all about politics. I think quietism is unbiblical because it teaches the false doctrine that Christianity has no political implications. I don't think that's true. I think it definitely has political implications. And so to be quietist is to omit the parts of the gospel with political implications. The second tradition is hyper-partisanship, right? Greg Locke's church, where Christianity and the Republican Party are the same, and you must be a Republican to be a Christian, okay? I think that's wrong. The third tradition that I think is probably most widespread is a kind of a selective single issue political engagement, where you'll often hear white pastors preach about the evils of abortion and sometimes the evils of gay marriage, and that's it. You don't really hear about many other political issues or causes at all. And so those are the three traditions you tend to see in white evangelical churches, and I think they're all flawed. The answer to your question is, I think we have an underdeveloped political theology in white evangelicalism. I think we have an underdeveloped political theology. I think politics is a much broader, more robust thing than abortion and gay marriage. And it's much bigger than the Republican Party, right? And I think to preach the whole counsel of the gospel is to apply it to every facet of human life, not just your individual life and your family life, but also to your vocational life, your work life, your neighborhood life, your civic life, and to bring the renewing work of the Holy Spirit into everything you do. That's a political message in the sense that it applies to the whole polis, the whole city, state neighborhood that you live in. And that's the kind of preaching I'd like to hear.
Yeah, amen.
Caleb, I'm going to use my privilege as a host to ask the next question, if that's all right.
Sure. I think it might be the last one too now.
Okay. I'm still going to use it.
Do it.
I feel like there's like on this question of how dangerous is it really, there's just like one big question kind of hanging out there that we haven't really gotten to, and that is, regardless of how many people believe in the dangerous forms of Christian nationalism, there's the possibility of a Trump presidency, which would have appointees who believe these dangerous things, who are in high levels of government, right? So, and at that point, does it become dangerous? Is this something that y'all both would agree on, that this is like a real danger that's not present now, but could be in the future?
Yes. Although it does depend on which parties control House and Senate. It's not just Trump himself. Like if it's Trump plus Republicans in the House and Senate, then you might actually see some troubling public policy. I worked for the government for 10 years, and God bless how inefficient our government is. So even if Trump is elected and he's got a bunch of Republican allies everywhere, it's still not going to happen overnight. It does call for vigilance on the part of citizens, and hopefully the courts will maintain their independence. But I do want to be a little bit realistic about how our government actually functions. There's thankfully so many veto points and so much kludge and so much inefficiency that even look, Trump had Republican control of Congress for 2 years last time and never built the wall. So, and that was like his signature issue. So the revolution's not coming the day after the election. I'm still worried. I want to be very clear, and I don't want to see that world. But let's take a deep breath.
I think we have to be real careful just labeling people that we dislike Christian nationalists. So let's talk about 3 of Trump's appointees to the U.S. Supreme Court: Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barron. To Andrew Seidel, these are white Christian nationalists bent on taking America over for Christ and oppressing everyone. How do we know? Well, look at the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe versus Wade. That's as Christian nationalist as you get. Well, I don't think you can, in any reasonable universe, call those folks white Christian nationals. Clarence Thomas to Seidel is a white Christian nationalist as well. And so I just don't know. Frankly, on an issue like abortion, Trump's been pretty disappointing, right? I mean, the justices have been great, but he's made it crystal clear he's not going to attempt to act on this at the national level, leave it up to the states. He's critical of Florida's 6-week ban and that sort of thing. I have always been distrustful of Trump, and I'm not sure we can count that his appointment, were he to get reelected, will even be conservative in any stripe, in any way, shape, or form. And yes, I don't know what to think. All of that said, I do not like Donald Trump. I do not want him to be elected, so I hope we don't find out what sort of candidate people he would appoint for office.
I agree with your comments on the Supreme Court. I will say there are some people in the Trump orbit. A guy named Russ Vought, who's the head of the Center for Renewing America, is why the scuttlebutt is he may be a chief of staff or head of domestic policy or something. And he's quite clearly embraced the label, I believe, of Christian nationalism. And if you look at his kind of policy statements, it's very Christian nationalist. So I think that there will be influential Christian nationalists in a Trump administration with the position and authority to do something about it. So yeah, I'm worried, but thankful for the inefficiency of our government.
You know, we'll say that even if this were to come about, we still have important constitutional protections in place, even though the Supreme Court has been far better with the Establishment Clause. Oh, yeah. It's still going to find problematic any policy that favors Christianity above other faiths. I can guarantee you that.
Yep.
Paul and Mark, thank you so much for giving us your time this evening. I pray that it's been helpful to those of you watching and those of you who will watch later. Knapp, I believe, has just some concluding words.
Yes, I thank you all. Thanks to everyone for joining. Thanks to our guest speakers, Mark Hall, Paul Miller. If you appreciate this webinar and the resources we provide, please consider making a donation to the American Values Coalition. I'll just put the link in the chat, or you can go to americanvalues.org and hit the donate button. And it's through our generous supporters that we're able to bring you this webinar and so many other resources that you can find both on our YouTube channel and on our website. So thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.